Thank you so much for streaming our latest message from First Baptist Church. Here at FBC, our mission is to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ. We do that by thinking big, thinking small, thinking in, and thinking out. We hope that this message helps you as you continue to grow in your faith. If you would like to stay connected to FBC, you can visit our website at FBCLLOYD.ca, look us up on Facebook and Instagram, or download our free mobile app. Now here's the latest from FBC. Enjoy.
Hello again, everyone. Good to see you. You know, I like long weekends because I find out who my favorites are. You're my favorites. If you're visiting with us, you went right to the top of the pack. Awesome to have you. Long weekends can always be a little bit of an interesting endeavor. Hey, I don't know what's going on in your worlds this coming week, but in my world, this is a monumental week. On Tuesday, August the 8th, Fran and I are going to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary. Thank you very much. You know, it's, I'm sure, like most of you, we've had our ups, we've had our downs, we've had our challenges, we've had times that have gone extremely well, but one thing that I can say for sure, absolutely, unequivocally, is that the last 25 years have been the happiest years ever for Fran. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to die later. I might not make it the 25th. For me, they've been awesome, and God was really good to me when He brought me Fran, and so I'm thankful, very thankful for her and for 25 years. Very cool. Like Ryan mentioned, we're in our series. We're going through the 7 deadly sins, and I hope that you've been enjoying it. We're in week 5 of those. There's just 2 left to go after this. So far, we have covered pride, anger, gluttony, and lust. And today, we're going to take on envy. And because we've also got communion, we're going to dive right in and we're going to get right at this. So, when you come to envy, the definition or understanding of envy is this. One's discontented desire to have a quality, attribute, or possession of another person which leads them to resent and even hate the possessor. So, let me say that again. To envy is when one has a discontented desire to have a quality, attribute, or possession of another person which leads them to resent and even hate the possessor of that attribute, quality, or possession. So even a really cursory contemplation of this topic, of the idea of envy, leads us to understand that it covers a broad spectrum. I can be envious of someone's looks. I can be envious of someone's brains. I can be envious of their voice. I can be envious of their house, their car. I can be envious of their family, how well they're doing. I can be envious of their skin tone, that they tan better than I do. I can be envious of their wit. And the list goes on and on and on. All kinds of different things that we can be envious of. And it doesn't take much more time to be able to conclude that the state of being envious is not a happy place. When we enter into envy and we become envious, we are not having a good time. At that point, this is not going well. When we become envious, we have somehow defined ourselves as inferior to someone else by virtue of an attribute that they have, by virtue of a quality that they have, by virtue of a possession that they have. Somehow they are superior to ourselves, and our pride is wounded. And what that leads to then is us begrudging the other person, becoming resentful of them for whatever it is that they have that we don't. And as that takes place, then more often than not, that resentment, that begrudging, leads us to degrade them in some way. We try and bring them down to our level, or even preferably below our level. So as we consider envy this morning, there's no doubt that when we envy, we're not in a good place. And as we consider envy this morning, we need to understand that it is a dark road that only gets darker the further that we go down it. In his book, The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis talks about hell. And in the passage that I'm going to read to you in just a moment, I think that the validity of what he has to say is typified so well by our contemplation of the sin of envy this morning. Listen to this. Lewis writes, "Hell begins with a grumbling mood, always complaining, always blaming others. But you are distinct from it. You may even criticize it in yourself and wish you could stop it. But there may come a day when you can no longer. Then there will be no you left to criticize the mood or even enjoy it, but just the grumble itself going on forever like a machine. It is not a question of God sending us to hell. In each of us, there is something growing which will be hell unless it is nipped in the bud." Let me read that for us again. Because as we think of envy, as I think of envy, this just rings so true to me of where envy takes us and the course that we set ourselves on as we allow it to rest, root in our hearts and in our lives. Hell begins with a grumbling mood. Always complaining, always blaming others. As I envy, I start to grumble. Because I'm dissatisfied. I'm discontent. And I begin to complain about what's going on, what I see around me. And I start to blame others for what's going on, what they have that I don't have. And it starts out that I'm distinct from it. I can recognize that that's an attitude in my life. And I may even criticize it. I may look at it and say, "Doug, you shouldn't do that. That's wrong to envy." And I might even wish that I could stop it. I really need to deal with that. But if I don't, there may come a day when I can no longer stop it. Then, Lewis continues, there will be no me left to criticize the mood or even enjoy it, but just the grumble of envy itself, going on forever like a machine, as I look at one person after another person and envy what they have and grumble about the fact that I don't. It is not a question of God sending us to hell, he says. In each of us there is something growing which will be hell unless it is nipped in the bud. Let's just pray, and then we'll dive in and look at envy a little bit deeper. Father, this morning, God, I would ask again that you would come and that you would help us to examine our lives. This morning, God, would you convict us of our envy? Would you point it out in our hearts and our minds, where we employ it, where we've allowed it to take root, where it rests? Help us, God, to expunge it, to expel it, so that we would be able to avoid hell on earth as envious people, discontent, resentful, begrudging those around us, and sinning against you. So to that end, again, God, I ask that you would work by way of your Spirit, I ask in Jesus' name, for his sake. Amen. Okay, if not nipped in the bud then, envy can have a devastating effect in our lives in a number of ways, 3 of which I want to look at quickly this morning. The first one is this: envy divides us from friends and family. We're going to look at 2 passages of Scripture here just to exemplify that. Starting in, first of all, with Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. If you've got your Bibles with you, please turn to it. If you don't have a Bible with you, you can use one of the pew Bibles that's in front of you. If you've got it on your phone, awesome. If not, it'll be on the screen. Genesis chapter 4, first book of the Bible, 4 chapters in. And it starts off round about verse 2 saying this: Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions, from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Let's stop right there. I want to point out 3 things, and we've talked about them before, but it bears, again, pointing them out this morning as God talks to us about sin in our lives. First of all, notice number 1, God says to Cain, sin is crouching at your door. We need to understand this morning again, we need to take it to heart that sin is crouching at our door. It is waiting for us to go out where it can pounce. So it is not something that we might just happen to run into, that by chance we might stumble across. It is targeting us and waiting outside our door. And we then need to pay attention to that. We need to understand that it is there, that we are going to encounter it, that we can't avoid it. And we need to be prepared accordingly. Because number 2, God says, it desires to have you, which is to say, it desires to take you out. Satan is trying to take you out. And again, we hear that, but we don't take it to heart. And so we blow through the door unprepared, ill-equipped to deal with sin, because that's number 3, what God points out, is that you must rule over it. God points at us. He says to Cain, he says to me, Doug, it is your responsibility to rule over sin in your life. Now, our society, I've said it before, our society tells us exactly the opposite. Over and over, day in and day out. Over and over, day in and day out. It's not your fault. It's not your responsibility. You were raised incorrectly. It's your parents' fault. You don't have the wherewithal because your socioeconomic status isn't sufficient for you to deal with this issue. If you had more money, you'd be fine. If you had a better education, you'd be able to handle this, but you don't have. And so therefore, don't worry. It isn't on you. And God comes along and he says, wait a second, dude. This is on you. Sin is your responsibility to rule over. So we have to today go away understanding that I have a responsibility, personal responsibility, contrary to what the world tells us. Where they say we have no responsibilities. All we get is the benefits. All we have is the rights. No responsibilities. That would be a drag. God comes along, he tells us the truth. This is on you and me. We have to shoulder this ourselves. And we will be responsible for it one day. Let's carry on. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. And now we look at that and we read this passage and we blow right through it. God has this little sit down with Cain and says, here's the deal, dude. Sin's waiting outside your door. It seeks to have you. You must rule over it. And Cain dismisses it. And we think to ourselves, how does that happen? Like, where was Cain's head? God just talked to him. Said, this is a problem. Deal with it. But out to the field they go. Cain takes Abel out there and kills him. He allows his enviousness of Abel to overcome him, and he kills his brother. Because Abel had God's favor. He brought an offering that was appropriate. Unlike Cain. And God acknowledges that and smiles on Abel. And Cain's frustrated because he didn't get the nod from God. And we think to ourselves like, man, dude, like, open your eyes, man. You just heard what you're supposed to do. But how many of us, you and me, are going to walk out the doors of the church after this message, ignore the fact that sin is crouching outside this door, not be worried about the fact that it seeks to have us, to take us out, and we begin before we even get out of the parking lot, envying somebody about something, that they have such a nice vehicle. How is that? That they look so good today. Look at them in their perfect family. And we'll do exactly what Cain does. Right after God's had the sit down with them. And we look at Cain and think, whoa, dude. And we do it ourselves. Let's look at another passage. Joseph and his brothers in Genesis 37. If you've been reading in your grip journals, you'll be coming to this. You've maybe read it already. Genesis 37. Starting somewhere, I forgot. Whoever writes my messages didn't put down what verse we're starting in. It looks like about 2 or 3 maybe. I'm going to have to talk to him. Now, Israel, which is Joseph's father, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So his brothers look around one day and they recognize that Joseph has Israel's heart. He's the favored son. And they hate Joseph because of it. And understandably, it's not right that Israel would have a favorite son and show favoritism and so on and so forth. That's not good. But it does not justify their envy of Joseph. That would be the world telling us, it's not your fault. Bad Israel. Shouldn't have shown favoritism. Now you're envious. Understand that. That's what the world tells us. God says, no way. Doesn't matter. Israel wasn't doing it well. It's on you, boys. This is your problem. And we come to verse 11, where it says that his brothers were jealous of him. Jealous and envy, synonymous, can be interchanged in this regard here. And so as they pursued it then, they decide they're going to take matters into their own hands. They've had enough. Tired of him getting the nod all the time. Tired of him being the favorite. So they seek to kill him. And only because Reuben sort of halfway intervenes in the whole process, they throw him in a cistern instead. And while he's in the cistern, then they decide, hey, why would we kill him? We're not going to get anything out of that. We might as well sell him into slavery. At least then we get something out of this whole thing. So they sell him into slavery, and off they go. Their envy took over, and their actions followed suit. As we allow ourselves to be envious, it doesn't take long before that manifests itself in our lives to those around us. We want it to stay in our head, but it comes out. And it becomes obvious. Sometimes, often, maybe even especially to those that we are envious of. It starts out as a thought, as that little discontent, that thing that's bothering me about that person. But then I'm unprepared. I'm not ready to just let it lie there. Then I have to do something about it. And so we start to see it creep out in our words and in our actions, because we can't just leave it at the mental level. We convince ourselves it's wrong. They shouldn't have that. It's unfair that they have that. They don't deserve that. So I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to try and bring them down. Now, nowadays, we don't usually jump straight to murder, although I think if we look, probably wouldn't take that long, actually, through the news cycle. We could find somebody that has actually murdered somebody out of envy. I don't think that that would be that unusual today. But for the most part, for most of us, we're more civilized. We're more sophisticated. So we don't go straight to murder, at least not physical murder. Instead, we go to character assassination. That kind of murder I'm okay with. I'll take somebody out at the knees. I'll take their character down a notch or two because they've got something I don't have. My pride is wounded. So we gossip about them. Oh, I see Sally over there. Doesn't she look good? Oh, yeah, she looks good. But I understand that with a good surgeon and 65 grand, that's what you can get. Just a good plastic surgeon and 65 grand. It wasn't what she brought to the table on her own. She couldn't have done that on her own. She had to have had help. Right? We try to slander them. Well, hey, there's Tom over there. Man, he's done well for himself. Look at how well he's doing. And yeah, he's done well for himself. Sure he has. For every deal that comes in the front door, he's got 3 going on out the back door. For every dollar that's coming over the table, there's 3 more that are happening underneath. That's how that's working. He's done well for himself. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Or else we try and run interference. We hear that Tom and Sally are having a party. And so what we decide to do is, well, wait a second. That's not good that they would have all the buddies over there, everybody going to their house. So I'm gonna have a party that day too. I'm gonna get my invitations out first. I'm gonna try and take them down a notch. They're not gonna have everybody at their party. I'm gonna have them at my party. Or else, even better, what I'm gonna do is they've got a caterer coming apparently. Isn't that nice? Well, what I'll do is I'll just tell everybody that after the last event that caterer did, everybody got food poisoning. That'll bring their party down to size. Not everybody's not going to love them anymore. No way. They can't be that popular. So we go after it. And in our envy, we start to cause a division in the relationships of our lives, with our family and with our friends, because we act out on it. And people start to look around and go, Doug, dude, what's up with you, man? I don't need this. You're always grumbling and complaining. You're never satisfied. You're never okay to just live and let live. You're a drag. I don't want to be around you. And much less the person that I'm slandering, that I'm gossiping against, that I'm trying to run interference of because I'm envious. And they're looking around going like, man, what's up with you? What did I ever do to you? Just keep your distance. I don't need the aggravation. And it happens with our friends. It happens with our family. As we allow it into our hearts and into our minds and into our actions. And it doesn't quit. It never stops with just that one person. Because then we look around and then there's another person. And they've got that. I dealt with them with this, but now look at this. And then it's the next, and then it's the next, and then it's the next. And pretty soon I'm isolated and alone. Envy divides us from our family and friends. Number 2, envy robs us of our potential and our joy. An example of that is Saul, King Saul, in 1 Samuel chapters 9 to 31. Let's turn and read that. No, I'm not going to read 22 chapters. But I would encourage you to. Go home and read through the story. Starts off 1 Samuel 9 verse 2. We find out that Saul was tall and handsome. He stood head and shoulders above the rest of the crowd. He had a physical stature that was awesome. And he was handsome to go with it. Not just big, but tall, dark, and handsome. And then, God chooses him as the first king of Israel. Now, granted, God didn't want a king. He didn't want a king. But the people wanted a king, and so God relents and says, okay, well then Saul is going to be the first king of Israel. So he's hand-chosen by God, which is a pretty nice nod. And as we see with David, God can do a lot with you as the king of Israel. He can take you a lot of places. Life can be pretty nice. But for Saul, even though he started off well, had some military victories and things were going all right, and the people liked him. They endorsed him as the king. They were happy. But as David comes into the picture, as David grows in his prominence, Saul becomes increasingly unhappy, discontented, resentful, and envious of David. 1 Samuel 18 verses 5 to 9 say this: whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. So it starts off, well, this is awesome. Kid doing great. I'll elevate him, give him a promotion. And it pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. So it's going well again. Everybody's even happy with Saul. Like he's recognizing David's a good guy. We're liking what he does. Saul's promoting him. This is good. Everything's fine. Verse 6, though, everything starts to go a different direction. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, and with timbrels and lyres. Verse 7, as they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And then we hit verse 8. And Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. Wait a second. I'm the king. Why is he getting all the notoriety? Why is he getting all the acclaim? This cannot be good. And Saul's thinking in his head, they've credited David with tens of thousands, but with me only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. He didn't just keep a close eye on him. He tried to kill him. And that becomes his objective over the next 13 chapters. Saul starts to chase him, trying to kill him. And instead of paying attention to what he should have been paying attention to, the enemies of Israel and dealing with some of the real problems, Saul becomes preoccupied with trying to eliminate David, deal with that. And so instead of Saul following God, paying attention to what God has to say, where God wanted him to go, and what God wanted him to do, instead of focusing on God, Saul fixated on David. And as a result, we see his decline. He goes off the rails. He ends up being beheaded after being beaten in battle. And the Philistines take his body as a trophy, and they hang it on the wall outside their city. Saul and his sons. And so then at that point, then some of Saul's men have to go and get his body. They go back, take his body away, and the boys as well. They burn them, and then they bury their bones under a tamarisk tree in their town. Saul had all this potential. He could have been so happy doing what God had asked him to do as the king of Israel, allowing God to bless him and to build them into a great nation like happened with David. But he became fixated, even to the point maybe where he was driven mad by his envy of David. And it robbed him of the potential and of the joy that could have been his. It reminds me of Proverbs 14:30, which says, "A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones." Envy rots the bones. It will rob you. Lastly, number 3, sin separates us from God. And here's the real problem with the sin of envy. And it's the same problem that we find with every other sin. Envy is no exception. Envy separates us from God, as does all sin. The other two problems are pragmatic and practical. I've divided myself away from my family. I've separated myself from my friends. Well, that's not happy. That's tragic. And I've lost my potential. I've lost my joy. Well, that's horrendous as well. But the real problem with envy is that it's sin against God, and sin against God separates us from God. When we envy those on a horizontal level, when we have an issue with those around us, our friends, our families, our neighbors, when we have issues on that level, then we have to understand that we have an issue as well vertically with God. Obviously, God takes issue with sin. There's no doubt about that. But when we sin, when we envy, we precipitate our own withdrawal from God. We hasten it ourselves. When we see people getting ahead of us, or with more ability than we have, etc., we begin to question God, and we naturally pull away from Him. Which is exactly the opposite of what Paul tells us is his secret to finding contentment in Philippians. Paul says that he has found the secret of being content in all circumstances. Doesn't matter, with little or with much. In peace or in danger, he's content with God. And he's found that contentment comes by focusing on God. Sometime maybe we'll have a chance to take a look at that. That when we focus on God, when we chase after Him, then Christ gives us contentment in our lives that allows us not to be bogged down by discontentment with those around us. Where we don't get dragged into the resentment and begrudging and the grinding, the grumbling, the machine that becomes hell on earth itself. Because He's given us contentment. He's reprioritized our lives so that we can understand them properly and not be distracted by this incorrect, wrong hierarchy of life that we make for ourselves, where we evaluate qualities and attributes in a hierarchy, in a ranking that causes us to envy. We need to focus on God, because otherwise envy will lead us to separation from God. It leads us to question God's goodness. We look around and we say, how can God be good? How can God be good when they have all of that and I don't? I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm following Him. But they've got all this stuff. She's got all those looks. He's got all that cash. He's funny. whatever. And we question God's goodness. We question his wisdom and guidance. Well, how can God be smart if this is where I'm getting with him? Doesn't he see that everybody's getting ahead of me? I'm not sure that I trust this plan of his. I'm not going to follow his advice. I'm going to handle this on my own, thank you very much. And ultimately, then we question his love. Well, there's no way. I don't know. He maybe is good. He maybe is even wise, but there's no way he can love me. Because I'm getting nothing here. I'm getting left behind. He doesn't care about me. Doesn't love me. And we take a step away from God. We take a step in the opposite direction of what will bring us what we're looking for. 1 Corinthians 13 verse 4 says, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. When we envy, we push love out. We push away from love. And it begins first with those around us, and then it leads very quickly to God. We push them out, and then we push him out. We start to do it ourselves. We start to follow our own path. We start to lean on our own wisdom and guidance. And it separates us and leaves us isolated and miserable. And when we don't love, we don't know God. 1 John 4:8 says, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. And so as we allow envy to take root in our hearts and our minds, and as it begins to color and influence our actions and our words, we lose our love and we lose touch with God. Today, we come to communion, and we're reminded in Romans 5:8 that God demonstrated his own love for us in this, and that while we were yet sinners, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us.